Today we're going to be talking about my crotch, Uncomb's design. Now before you go anywhere, give me a minute to explain. I have a really awkward body. I'm 6'8" and have a figure slightly reminiscent of Gumby. This creates a couple of problems when I'm using the table saw. My first problem has to do with the height of my table saw itself. It's only 34 inches off the ground, meaning if there's anything that happens to fly off the table saw, or maybe there's some kickback or anything else happens, it puts me in a really dangerous spot below the belt, and that's a very real concern when I'm out there working. The second problem that this creates is when it comes to coplanar surfaces. Since the height of my table saw isn't adjustable, I take all the other surfaces in my shop and make them coplanar with the table saw. This makes moving sheet goods and other things around easier. But since I'm so tall, this creates a problem for my back. Table saws in general are pretty low to the ground, and you don't have to be as tall as me to experience these problems. I like having higher work surfaces. It makes things like using hand tools or working on electronics or maybe even sanding a lot more comfortable, and I can last a lot longer out in the shop doing these things. The third area of concern for me is when I'm reaching over the saw to grab something from the outfeed side, or for whatever reason I have to reach. The top of the saw hits me about mid-thigh, meaning when I reach over and bend my body over, the saw gets a lot closer to me than I would like. And that gives a whole new meaning to this demonstration. Yeah. The solution for all of these problems was to simply build a riser for the saw to sit on. To do this, I purchased some pre-cut aluminum extrusion and bolted it together. But instead of me sitting here and explaining it to you, let me show you.
My main concern with this part of the build really came down to the weight of the saw. It's roughly around 500 pounds depending on what accessories you have. So I used 1.5 inch aluminum extrusion. I reached out to the manufacturer that I purchased it from and showed them my drawing just to be sure it would hold the weight, and they said it would. I used heavy-duty quarter brackets and heavy-duty leveling feet to finish off the build. The leveling feet were a little tall, so I cut those down to size. I skinned all of the sides with plywood. I used 3/4 inch for all the sides and laminated 2 sheets of 3/4 inch plywood for the top, just because of the weight concerns. I used 1/4-20 hardware to bolt this directly onto the aluminum extrusion, and that was a really simple and easy solution.
My shop is super small and I have to utilize every inch possible to be the most efficient. I noticed that underneath the right side of my saw, where there's the extension wing, there was a lot of unused space. So I built a cabinet with multiple drawers and some storage for some Festool products to go there.
I won't get really in depth here about how I built this. If you go back and watch my miter station build, you'll see I used the exact same method of construction. I use glue and screws to hold everything together, and the pocket hole joinery that I use is just really quick and easy for shop projects. This cabinet that I'm building has a total of 6 compartments. The top 4 compartments and the 2 that are on each side are just general storage. The bottom left is a drawer for my Festool Sustainer products. The drawer on the bottom right is going to be used to hold my miter gauge, as well as all my blade storage, and you'll see exactly how I tackle that momentarily. Once again, I used 3/4 inch plywood all the way around, with 1/2 inch plywood for the drawer bottoms and the back of the cabinet. I use pocket holes to create the drawers, just like I do in all my other projects, and they'll be hidden by the drawer front. Speaking of drawer fronts, I use this Craig jig to get my hole spacing right for my drawer hardware, and then I attach the drawer fronts to the drawers with screws through those holes. This temporarily holds the fronts in place where I want them after getting my spacing right. I then drive in screws from the inside of the drawer, and that's my permanent hold, so I can remove the outside screws and then add the hardware. This saw blade and miter gauge storage is my favorite part of this cabinet. To store the blades, I epoxied some 5/8 inch bolts to this plywood vertical panel. These are the same size as the arbor on the table saw and hold the blades nicely. I temporarily held the drawer front to the vertical panel in place with brad nails and then came back with pocket screws to do a permanent hold in conjunction with the glue. To hold the miter gauge in place, I simply used magnets and wooden supports just to hold it in place and keep it from falling off.
Finally, in the same way that I maximize space with the drawer underneath, I decided to create an outfeed table that also serves as a work surface for me. This allows me to utilize as much space as possible without having a dedicated bench.
For the last phase of this build, I created my outfeed table. I reused my T-track bench that you might have seen in my previous video for the main body. I created a sub-top with 3/4 inch MDF and permanently affixed this to the top of this metal frame. I wanted a removable top just in case it gets damaged long term, so I used 1/2 inch plywood for my final top, which is, I guess you could call the show face of this outfeed table. This is just held in place with screws from the bottom, so if I ever get to a point where I need to replace it, I can pull those screws out and pop the plywood off. I flush trimmed everything so I can get a nice clean edge that I can then put a wood panel on to give it a finished surface. For this finished surface, I had some ambrosia maple laying around, so I cut this into appropriate size strips, and then I can just glue and brad nail this in place. I made sure not to get brad nails too high because I didn't want it to go into the plywood top in case I need to remove it later. Next, I flush trimmed these side pieces in line with the top, and I was very careful and had really good support here with my router because it's heavy and there's a lot of bit exposure with this, so take your time if you're going to do this type of operation. Next, I rounded over the corners for a more finished look and ease of moving wood on and off the table. Next, I routed in T-track slots, and I'm using less T-track here than I did in my T-track table build. I really figured out what exactly I need in that build, so I'm putting the appropriate amount and it's less space to get glue in. I routed out channels for the miter slots on the table saw so I can use jigs very easily with this outfeed table. My side decorative piece extends all the way from the outfeed all the way to the front of the saw, and I use 1/4-20 hardware just to bolt this onto the saw, and it gives a nice and clean look and makes the whole thing look more cohesive. All that was left was gluing the T-track in place, which I did with some 2-part epoxy, and then followed it up with some number 6 screws. The epoxy does the majority of the work here. With that, this build was finished, and I am super happy with how it came out. My back is so much happier, and I can work outside for much longer, and I've just loved having these higher surfaces. The additional storage and having accessories for the table saw close and within arm's reach have been a game changer. And I can just not say enough about having a large work surface / outfeed on the back side of the saw. It's really been a great setup for me.
Thank you guys so much for checking out this episode of Combs Design. In the next episode, I am going to thank you guys, the subscribers, who have continued to help me grow this channel, and I've really seen some amazing growth, and I can't thank you guys enough. So in the next episode, we're going to talk about some changes I've made, the way we're going to do things differently going forward, and just some super exciting news, and really just take a minute to thank you guys, the subscribers, for all your support and your continued support as we move forward. Thank you guys so much, and I will catch you on the next one.